Support for Radio Friends comes from OsteoStrong. Improvements in bone density, strength, and power can be achieved by weekly 5-minute no-sweat sessions on their 4-spectrum machines. These isometric robotic machines safely emulate high-impact loading on different parts of the skeletal system, which stimulates activity in bone-building cells. Balance and agility can be improved by 2-minute sessions on vibration plates. Every session is supervised by a trained coach. Learn more on Facebook or call to set up a complimentary wellness assessment and session. Good morning and welcome to Radio Friends on Thursday, May the 12th. We've got some interesting topics for you today. I want to introduce you to Dr. Chris Link. He is the owner of Integrative Medicine Clinic in Jefferson City. Good to have you here.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be here.
Integrative Medicine Clinic is what? Where this is where you work with people's good health and also good eating?
Yeah. So we bring together the very best of conventional medicine, but we add the complementary medicine and really leverage things like nutrition and exercise and sleep and relaxation and bring those things together for a more resilient, healthy person that may be less reliant on medications, although we use them as we need them.
Yeah. Now, you came up here today with some interesting information that may shock some people.
Yes.
We'll talk about whole dairy products in just a minute, but also a recent study about fermented foods.
Yes.
Now, what considered fermented foods?
So things like sauerkraut and kimchi and yogurt.
Pickles.
And pickles, which is probably a favorite of many of our listeners today. All of those things are fermented foods if they have live culture. So if you get the sauerkraut, you're going to want to get it from the refrigerator section of the grocery store so that the bacteria, the probiotics are live and they're healthiest that way for us.
No, wait. So the canned sauerkraut is not the same?
Not the same. Because
it's still fermented, though.
It may be fermented or it may have been just made with vinegar. So that may have give it its twangy, acidy taste that preserves the cabbage, but it's not really the fermented bacteria. The bacteria create lactic acid naturally, and that creates the twang in the live, rather than using a vinegar, for example, to pickle something or to pickle sauerkraut. So the live bacteria, so you're going to find it in the refrigerator section. There's many of these, and so things like kimchi and sauerkraut and kombucha, which is a drink, but also dairies like cheeses with live culture, and they'll be in the refrigerator section, of course. And then kefirs and yogurts, all of those things are wonderful.
Now you got on here whole fat yogurt. There's a difference between the whole fat yogurt and the low fat yogurt?
Well, it turns out that, it turns out that whole fat dairy, and we can get into that in more detail, is that it's really healthier for us. That many studies over the last 10 years have shown that the whole fat dairy really leads to less diabetes, leads to less weight gain, and leads to less cardiovascular disease.
Now, this goes against everything that we have read and been taught for many years now.
Many years.
That skim milk is better for you than whole milk. But you're saying new studies are coming out showing that whole milk is better for you than skim milk.
Yeah, there's a sea change that saturated fats are not a major cause of cardiovascular disease.
Then why, over all these years, have we been told to stay away from those fats?
I think in the 1970s and 80s, it seemed to us that the saturated fats were causing increased cholesterol and increased heart disease. But when it's really looked closer, it's really more of the trans fats. And those are becoming out of our food supply now, the trans fats, because those are more of a manufactured fat.
So what is the difference between the trans fat and the saturated fat?
Well, trans fats are they're really not natural products. They're mostly created by heat, and they're mostly created when oils are changed in a way so that they can be preserved for longer, and there's a longer shelf life for things that live in the middle of the grocery store. So those aren't healthiest for us, and we're really removing those from our food supply.
Okay.
Now, saturated fats over the last 10 or 20 years, there's been more studies suggesting that they're not a major cause of cardiovascular disease. And in the very most important journal of heart disease, called the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, about a year ago, they presented a paper, and actually a statement that said that saturated fats were not a major cause of cardiovascular disease, and we didn't need to limit it in our diet. Then, Paul, there was a very interesting recent study in Scandinavia where they followed a large group of Scandinavians, and they measured the blood component that tells us if we're eating dairy. There's a specific fat we can measure in the blood now. And the people who had the highest levels of dairy fat over that 16-year period had the lowest incidence of cardiovascular disease, heart attacks and strokes. So it's a big sea change. There's been many, many studies over the last 20 years, so much so that the American College of Cardiology has changed its position and wrote so in their journal in August of 2020. And now we get this additional study that tells us that people who eat more dairy fat, I'm not saying eat it all day long, but the people who had the higher levels of dairy fat in their blood actually had less diabetes and less heart disease. That really puts things on its head, doesn't it, Paul?
It does. I'm sitting here listening to you. Now, does ice cream fall into that category?
So the problem with ice cream is that it's got sugar. And so what we know now is that one of the biggest causes of cardiovascular disease is highly processed foods, the kind of foods, the chips, the breads, the sweets, the cookies, the crackers, the ice cream. The sugar plus the fat is a detrimental problem. But if you eat a modest amount of whole fat, saturated fat, along with a diverse, rich diet that includes things like colorful vegetables and maybe some fish and maybe some fermented foods, that those things, all come together to give us the healthiest, most nutrient-dense, lowest inflammation diet we can eat. And inflammation is really a cause. And that's why fermented foods are so important, because in that very initial study, fermented foods were a miracle grow for the healthy microbiome, our gut bacteria, and it lowered inflammation in people. So that's why fermented foods are so important, because they're a miracle grow for our bacteria in our gut to help us be more resilient and less inflammation. And that saturated fats, if you choose a fermented food like a dairy, kefir or yogurt or live cultured cheese,
okay,
that's
how do you know
thing to eat.
When you buy the cheese, how do you know what is live cultured cheese?
It'll say it on there, but things like good cheddars and goudas and those kind of things are often, and they're refrigerated, they're often live cultured, then they'll say it. And they'll also say whether they're made from skim milk or whole fat. And there you want to generally choose the whole fat dairy. So
you want to choose the whole fat cheese. It seems like we're saying something that we should not be saying after years and years of...
It's really taken years and years of good research to turn this big battleship around, Paul,
okay.
and for the American College of Cardiology to change its position statement on it.
Okay. If you want to talk to the doctor, you can give him a call at Integrative Medicine Clinic in Jefferson City, and your telephone number is?
632,
how about 632-5585? Okay.
Caught me off guard there, Paul.
573-632-5585. And you're a medical doctor, and you try to incorporate all around good health into
the pillars of good health into good health care.
We're out of time. Thanks, Doc, for coming by.
Thanks, Paul.
Bye-bye.